Okay, so let's make a start on the webinar for today. I'm obviously going to be looking at the chat room as well as doing the talk, so I may be a bit slower in responding to any questions, but I will stop if I see any questions or comments that should be addressed. And the first point I wanted to make is that this talk really ties in particularly to next week, and it is related to what happens after the plan is produced, when the project is being implemented. So I'm not seeing this as being something that you need to think about as you're planning a project, and you as a facilitator need to work on as you're planning the project for other people. However, many of you are project managers yourselves, as well as facilitating perhaps work for other people. And it's also helpful to understand, I think, some of the connections between planning and implementation and some of the elements that seem to contribute to effective implementation. And we cover a number of those points, and we introduce some additional tools that can be helpful once projects are implemented to help them to seek improvement. And that's something that we do in next week's course. What I wanted to do here, though, is just talk a little bit about leadership, and which is a key topic and seems to be very influential in influencing project success. And so I think it's helpful for us all to have a view on what makes for effective leadership. And one of the points that I wanted to make in this talk is that as a leader, while sometimes it can be tempting to work on people, to try and change people to improve their performance, I think it's going to be more helpful for us if we try and focus on the system around people. Now, we're not talking here necessarily about the biological system that's affecting the species. We're talking more about the organizational system around the people who are doing the work. So, first things first, what is leadership? I wanted to start with a quote from our founder, a chap called Dr. Ulysses Seal, who, when asked about what pattern he saw in successful projects, and he had facilitated hundreds of planning projects around the world, when asked what did he see in the projects that seemed to succeed as opposed to those that fail, is that he saw that there was a charismatic and inspirational leader with a clear vision and ability to motivate staff. So there's some key points here that I wanted to pick up on and really pick apart a little bit more. We'll talk about motivation later on and how we are actually motivated. And we'll talk a little bit about vision and the role of the leader good. I'm pleased, Gary, that's what you would agree with. Talk about the leaders and their role in the establishment or the development of a vision. I also want to challenge a little bit this charisma, because I think that there is clearly a place for charismatic leadership. But I think for many of us and for many projects, what's really required is people who are able to understand what's stopping people within the project from doing their best work and working on those things, not necessarily having to spend their time thinking about driving forward with that long-term view. It's also about getting into the detail of the project. And maybe this is something we can discuss a bit later on and hear your views on. And it's clear that leadership is a hugely important topic to us within the conservation sector. And there are sort of a dribble of papers that are coming out around conservation leadership, particularly within the last 10 years or so. But it's still a relatively understudied area. And yet it does seem to be critically important for the success of projects. So we really should try and understand it a little bit better. So what I want to do is to, first of all, just take you through three strands or themes of leadership that have existed over the years. And probably one of the first sort of well-established lines of thinking around leadership sits within this bucket of command and control, which very much came out of the Industrial Revolution, where we had large factories, lots of people doing relatively menial, repetitive work to get things off the production line. So there was lots of work done around the Ford factories and other car manufacturers, where you have people doing specific jobs, and there was thought going into how do you encourage them to do better work or more of it. And this style of leadership is also referred to as transactional leadership. And the idea with transactional leadership is that, that if you give incentives to people, that they will do better work. And actually, if you take things away or potentially even give punishments to people, then that can discourage them from poor work. So it's a very tight sort of management that has at its sort of a fundamental premise that that you need to be on top of people to ensure that they do what you want them to do. And this was sort of challenged by another suite of theories that really fitted around our understanding of human behavior that came out in the 30s and 40s and subsequently, where we began to realize that, well, people are not machines, and they have their own inner, their desires, their wants, what things that motivate them. And actually, if we can understand some of these motivations, somehow we can inspire them to greater performance. So this more sort of transformational style of leadership, but particularly became very prominent in the 1980s. You had people like Steve Jobs from Apple, Nigel Branson in the UK with Virgin, and a number of other highly influential, very charismatic people who seem to be steering ships, these very large company ships, and towards great things. They became very successful. And there was a sense that the leader can play a critical role in providing vision, inspiring the staff to do their best performance. So whereas transactional leadership was very much around you've got to sit on top of people and use incentives and punishment, transformational leadership was much less about that very close management, but more about trying to tap into the person's desire to reach, do great things. And if a great leader is there, then they can help people to realize that potential. What is similar between these two styles of leadership is that they both put the leader at the center. But if you took the leader out of the picture, there's a suggestion that people then start losing their way. And then there's a third stream of theories that sit more around this idea of systems thinking. The philosophy behind systems thinking as a leadership philosophy is that actually people want to basically do good work. And this is similar to transformational. But rather than having to spend your time developing, an amazing, inspiring vision and injecting motivation, what we need to do is accept that the person themselves is able to realize that potential, but there are things around them that get in the way. But it's much more about getting into the detail of what might be stopping somebody from reaching their potential and changing things in the system in order to allow their inner potential to come out. So there's a subtle difference between systems thinking and transformational leadership. The systems thinking leader can be actually in the background. They don't need to be at the front and be very visible. But what they do need to be doing is focusing on those things that get in the way of people doing their best work. Now, each of these lines of thinking have their value. And I imagine you will have experienced at least one of these. I would bet money on the fact that you have experienced some form of transactional leadership. And it would be nice to think you've also experienced some transformational or system style of leadership. And it's also worth thinking a bit about where you sit and how you view people and what you need to do to encourage them to do better work. And in the rest of the talk, I want to look into our understanding, into our understanding of human behavior, in particular into motivation, and focus very much on the systems thinking approach. And I think this also aligns with some of the elements we've talked about earlier on in the course around how we plan project and we think about the components that need to be in place so that good things happen. So transactional leadership is around incentives and punishments. Transformational leadership, really focusing on motivation theory and systems thinking, where you're really looking at what's the factors around people that influence them in their work. And transactional and transformational leadership is also described as theory X or theory Y. And I want to now look at that by asking you to revisit those surveys that hopefully many of you have completed. If you haven't, don't worry about it at all. But if you have, could I ask you just to make sure you've totaled up your answers to Schedule A and Schedule B? And you should end up with a numerical value for each of your schedules. And I want to now just look at what those values suggest about the sorts of leadership we're experiencing and the sorts of leadership that we feel would get the best out of us. So we're going to do a bit of a poll. So I'm kind of hoping that some people have managed to do that, the survey. What I'd like you to do is to put your microphone on if you scored for Schedule A, you scored 60 or above in the results that you got. So if you can put your microphones on if you scored 60 or above. Okay, so we've got one person. Okay, thank you. Could I now ask you to put your microphone on if you scored 44 or below in Schedule A? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so now we're starting to see a bit more of a woodland of microphones being turned on. And then I imagine the rest of you either didn't have a chance to do it or would sit between the 45 and 59. Now, the suggestion there in that very kind of anecdotal, non-scientific study is that the majority of people on this call are currently experiencing more theory X style management. And I'll use management and leadership interchangeably because I think that they are, I would view it as two sides of the same coin, something we can talk a bit more about later if you wish. But you're experiencing generally X style management. We'll come to what that suggests in a second. What I'd now like to do is to look at your Schedule B and see what you got. So again, if you scored 60 or above for Schedule B, could you put your microphones on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 6 or 7 of you coming on for 60 or above. Great. You turn them off now, and then if you put your microphones on if you scored 44 or below. Okay. So we have one person putting their microphone on. So thanks very much for that. So what this is suggesting is that we are generally experiencing, Bahar, if you got 64, then you're very much in the strongly Y style management that you prefer. You're losing some of my voice. Can you hear me okay just now? Yes, okay, great. So so it looks like the majority of people are experiencing generally X style management, and yet the majority of you, in terms of what you feel, what would be your preference in how you were managed, is more on a Y style. And this seems to be a common pattern that emerges, definitely within the groups of people that I've worked with, that people are experiencing one style of management, and yet they feel that it would get more out of them if they were experiencing another. And quite commonly, the management style that people feel would get the best out of them is Y style management. And yet what they're experiencing is more X style management. Let's just have a quick look at what that means. So the suggestion with Theory X management, and so this sits within the transactional leadership approach, is that if people are subscribing to this, then there is a general perception that that others don't really want to do the work. Okay, that unless you are really sitting on top of people, perhaps not literally, but metaphorically, then they won't do their best work. The idea is that people generally like to be directed, that they avoid responsibility, and want security above all else. And I don't know whether you'll be able to reflect on the leaders that you were thinking about when you completed this schedule, and whether you feel that that kind of makes sense in terms of how you think they see the world. If you, though, are experiencing more Y-style management, which sits more within the transformational and perhaps moving more into the system-style approach, is that people want to work. They want to do their best work. They like self-direction. They like self-control. They are committed. And really what you need to do as a leader is perhaps give a little bit of direction, but then stand out of people's way. And this is quite interesting that we're getting this pattern coming out. And again, quite consistently within the conservation sector, that a lot of us are experiencing X-style management, very transactional style approach to management. And that management approach works in certain situations. It was probably quite effective within the industrial sector when people were doing menial tasks. It is probably very effective within the emergency sector, where you have to make quick, decisive decisions and people need to act rather than to discuss. But in a lot of situations we find ourselves in, if we think about some of the conservation decisions we have to make on a day-to-day basis, people are not doing menial tasks. People are doing quite creative tasks where they do require they need to be able to make quite complex decisions. And what's refreshing to know is that actually a lot of people within the sector would respond very well to this kind of more hands-off approach to leadership. But it's telling that we're not experiencing it in general. As far as you're concerned, there may be only so much you can do in terms of managing up. What you can do is be very aware of how you are managing down. So I would encourage you, if you've got staff that you work with, to ask them to complete this survey, perhaps anonymously, and get it back to you, because it would be quite instructive for you in terms of knowing whether your style of management is actually tying in with their preferred style of management. And if you're experiencing X-style management, and particularly if you are within a culture which generally subscribes to that view, then there may be a temptation to move more down that line than to move more towards the Theory Y style side. So I think it's important to reflect some time on both what we're experiencing, what we would prefer, and also how we are working with other people and whether or not that is getting the best out of them. And what's important to understand in trying to work out your, I suppose, preferred style of leadership, your tendencies, and what's most appropriate in many contexts, is to understand a bit more about motivation. And I'd like you to now, in the chat room, just to write down any examples, your first sort of top of the mind examples of what motivates you. Single words to just explain what motivates you. We're just going to have a look at some of the terms that are coming out. Okay, so we've got things like personal feeling, we've got accomplishment in there. Right, any other terms? Ellie is about sort of the team spirit. Okay, so how you're interacting with others around you. Passion. Oh, we've got passion coming out quite regularly, and connections with people, and supporting others to achieve. well, passion is coming out very heavily, and inspiration. So we've got there's some patterns that are emerging here. It's about kind of a sense. It seems to be about a sense of purpose. That there's something you believe very strongly in, and there's elements of accomplishment, in making a difference that seem to be quite important for people. And obviously, what ultimately, and as Patience points out, what may have driven us into this work in the first place is a love of nature. Okay. So there's quite a lot of, to me, what you're talking about are quite a lot of sort of internal, they're aspects that are relevant to you and how you feel about the world around you. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more depth. So if we think about why we do what we do, fundamentally, our behavior is influenced by our values, what we care about. Okay? And these will influence our assumptions and attitudes, which influences our behaviors, which then influences results. Now, there is a possibility of the consequences of our actions feeding back to change our values, but it's a relatively minor, it's a weak force. It's usually coming from within, and that determines what we do, that then influences what happens without. So trying to understand this inner feeling that, you talk about passion, a love of nature. These are quite internal, core-based feelings linked to your values that will influence how you then interact with the world around you. And many of you will have seen or have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And while it has been critiqued as being an oversimplification of what motivates people, I think there are some useful points from it. And what Maslow was saying was that there are sort of tiers or levels of concern that you need to get through in order to reach this highest point of self-actualization, where you are realizing your full potential. What Maslow was saying is that at its basic level, you will be driven by the need for air, food, water, etc. Those sorts of basic physiological needs. And if you don't have them, that they will get in the way of you moving to higher levels of motivation. Your motivation will stay at its most basic because they are fundamental needs. If, however, those needs are met, then your concerns might move to how safe you're feeling. And so this is where job security may come out, or your sense of safety within a field setting. And if you're feeling at all nervous about that setting, then that may well influence your ability or limit your ability to achieve higher levels of motivation. Some people were talking about belonging, about the kind of the team spirit, and this ties in with this third level of motivation. And the suggestion, according to Maslow, would be that if you're motivated by things like team spirit, the suggestion is that your safety concerns and your basic concerns are already met. And then people also talked about achievement, and that sits within this almost the highest level of esteem, moving into self-actualization. So people have the ability, according to Maslow, people have the ability to realize their full potential, to self-actualize, but they need to their needs need to be met at different levels in order for them to reach this point. And this ties in a little bit with systems thinking. When you think about, well, what is stopping somebody from realizing their potential? And if they're feeling a lack of job security or safety, or at its most basic level, if they're struggling to be able to put food on the table, then that is going to get in the way of them being able to reach their full potential. There are other things we can work on around belonging. So we've talked before in the course about team development and forming and storming, norming, etc. And how this really ties in with this third level of belonging. So there are multiple levels of need that need to be met in order for people to realize their full potential, be motivated by that highest level of concern, your ability to do your best. And if we and from that we can say, well, if you want to help people to be really motivated, then you need to think about some of these lower level concerns and check that they're where you can influence them, that they're in place in order for the person to do their best. It's not just about inspiring them with a vision if some of these basic needs are not being met. And the second piece of work I wanted to just refer to is work by Herzberg, who wrote this paper, One More Time, How Do You Motivate Employees, back in 1968. And it's been reprinted 5 times, at least. And the suggestion here is that even though this work was conducted many years ago, it's still relevant now. And the second point I think it makes is that we're not listening, because the paper keeps needing to be reprinted. And the key point of Herzberg's work was that you cannot motivate people. All you can do is create the conditions in which people are able to perform at their best. So this ties very much into a systems thinking approach to leadership. And what Herzberg did was he did a very large-scale study across a number of different sectors and grouped up workers into those that were dissatisfied and demotivated, those were dissatisfied were not dissatisfied but were also not motivated, and those on the far right that were both positively satisfied and motivated, and looked at what was going on within each of these groups, what were some of the themes. And he identified 2 sets of factors, hygiene factors and motivator factors. And from his work, he identified that there are a suite of factors that as a manager or as a leader, you need to get right, because if you don't, it gets in the way of people feeling satisfied and motivated. He called them hygiene factors. And some of these ideas up here will not be a surprise to you. You know, thinking about the working conditions in which people are operating, the policies in place for dealing with sick leave or holidays or whatever it might be, people's salaries and benefits. And it's not about people getting paid the most, but it is about people being paid fairly. And sometimes it's not possible to pay the industry standard, whatever that might be, for their area of work. But there are other benefits that can be given. There's a very interesting organization, a conservation organization in Assam, and they were not able to pay large salaries to their staff. But the additional benefit they were able to give is that if there was ever an elephant or some other large animal that was going to come into their farms at home, that they could leave work immediately and go back to defend their farms. And in this way, the employers were able to create conditions in which the employees felt, well, you know, I'm motivated at work, I can earn a salary, and I've got the freedom to be able to go back when I need to look after my crops. And this really didn't cost the organization very much financially, but there was a great gain in terms of perceived benefits to staff. There's status, job security, co-workers, and we can't do very much about people's personal life, but there are some other factors there where we can influence as managers and leaders. What Herzberg was saying is that if you can get the hygiene factors right, it's not about having the best policies or the best salaries, but if you can just get them, make sure that they are sufficient, you can then move over to the stuff that really does fan the flames in people. Some of the terms that you guys raised when asked about what motivates you: achievement, job challenge, recognition. These are some of the factors that can really encourage people to self-actualize, to realize their full potential. So as a manager or as a leader, particularly when you're looking at it from a systems thinking approach, there's effort that needs to go into making sure this basic stuff is right. If you've got leaking field stations and your bed is wet the whole time, then you're going to have demotivated or at least non-satisfied staff. They're not going to be performing at their best. But if you can just get those things right, then on the other side, you can spend your time thinking about how we're recognizing people, people's sense of achievement and acknowledging that. Are people getting an opportunity to grow in their development and their responsibility? And Hertzberg gave an analogy of his dog. He said, you know, I can make my dog move if I kick it. But movement is not the same thing as motivation. The dog is not motivated to move, it's just moved. Now, we can make people move. We can make people do work, which very much subscribes to a transactional approach. But that does not mean to say that they are motivated to do the work. And I think for us, recognizing humans as the most important resource we have, we need to understand and respect more what motivates people and how we can get rid of the things around them that demotivate them so they can then do their best work. I would, though, make just one additional point, and that is that there isn't one style of leadership that is right in all situations. And Blanchard and Hersey did some work on this situational approach to leadership and identified 4 leadership styles that you could turn to depending on the situation you were dealing with. Where you have somebody who might be new to a piece of work and might be feeling sort of therefore lacking in confidence or commitment to that work and ability, then you probably do need to use more of a directive approach, being quite close management, in quite close contact with them to ensure that they understand what they've got to do and how they do it. But as they start becoming a little bit more confident and competent at doing the work, then the manager or the leader can take a step back, maybe ask them questions. You know, if you do it this way, what might happen? What would happen in this situation? Encouraging them to think about what they do. So they're very much there still, but they're not telling the person exactly what they should be doing. They're learning through doing. And as the person becomes that bit more competent and more committed to that piece of work and feeling confident in being able to do it, then the leader can take a further step back into supporting, saying, you know, I'm going to be here if you need me, but I have confidence in your ability to do the job. You may check in with them afterwards to make sure things were done well, but you're not going to be closely managing them. And then finally, assuming they've managed to both become competent and confident in that work, then you're able to fully delegate, not get involved in it at all. We'll talk more about delegation in next week's lecture when we look at personal effectiveness and particularly looking at time management. But there are these levels of leadership, or where you're increasingly becoming distant from the person as their ability to do the work and their commitment to it increases. And they're going to increase from within these 4 categories, from somebody who's classed as being in D1, who maybe lacks specific skills and either unable or unwilling to take on the responsibility, all the way through to D4, where you have somebody who's experienced in the task and able to get on and do it independently. So one varies your leadership style depending on the situation and the person. You're going to move through this figure where you might start off directing somebody, moving to coaching, pulling back to supporting, and then finally delegating as the person becomes that bit more confident and committed and competent in the task. I think there are sort of 3 dimensions to leadership that are helpful to reflect on as well. And this might, yes, sorry, Gary's just made a point there about situational leadership. where he's saying that the leadership style can change situationally too, and an emergency requires the first one. Absolutely. So this isn't a linear process. We're not saying that you always go from stage 1 through to stage 4, moving from close management through to delegation. Sometimes you have to go backwards. And particularly where you've got somebody who may be very confident and competent in one area and therefore can be safely delegated to, in another area that may not be appropriate, and you may be managing them very closely. So the situational leadership model is very much what it says, what it does in the title. It's about changing your leadership style to suit the situation. I think 3 elements that stay fairly constant within leadership are begin firstly with thinking about, if I get it to come up, the intellectual side, being able to see the wood for the trees. And I think there's an important element, why I say about management and leadership being 2 sides of the same coin. I think there are times when the leader needs to be able to zoom up like a helicopter and be able to see the future. And that's where they can be helpful in developing the vision and seeing where we're going to. But they also need to helicopter in down to the ground, be able to see some of the detail. What is getting in the way of people doing their best work? And you're going to value gut feeling. While we want to make our decisions based on good science, good information, we shouldn't ignore our sort of inner sort of instinct around or what is that might be the right thing to do at a particular point in time. There's an emotional element to leadership. There's a need to be honest about when you're feeling comfortable and when you're not. There's a need to be able to listen very carefully, as we've talked about early on in the course, following meaning as well as the content of what somebody's saying. And I think as you become more senior within a project or an organization, it's increasingly important to know yourself, know your own strengths and weaknesses, and to be honest with them. It's not about trying to pretend to be a particular style of leader when you're not. I think it's about learning about yourself, where you feel comfortable, but also recognizing then overlaying that with what is going to be helpful in this particular situation. And then there's very much a behavioral aspect. It doesn't matter what we say on our, in our workshops when we're talking about ground rules, or what we say as our organizational values. If we don't practice them, then they are irrelevant. You need to be able to provide a role model. And so one element about leadership, which I think is really important to recognize, is that it's not just about behaving how you want to, as you may have been able to do when you were somewhere else in the organization. As you move up through a project or an organization, you have more and more people who will look up to you, and you have a greater responsibility to think about how you behave. I have perhaps a rather frivolous example. When I was heading up a department at Durrell Wildlife, there was an academy that we worked within, and it was a nice summer, and I decided that I could be more creative if I just went around the department barefoot. So I didn't wear any shoes, I was wearing shorts, I felt very comfortable, very creative, and thought this was perfectly fine. Until a couple of days later, when I saw my deputy head wandering around the department barefoot. And I thought to myself, what is that person doing? What happens if somebody comes in and sees our department and sees people walking around barefoot? How unprofessional does this look? I obviously didn't say anything because fortunately I checked myself and realized, we didn't have a meeting to say, okay, everybody, right team, now we're going to walk around barefoot. I just did it. And whatever I did was allowing others to do the same. So if you're somebody who has a tendency to allow your anger to come out, so frustration to come out sometimes, then you may well find that people around you feel comfortable doing the same thing. So if we want people to behave in a way that we feel is most appropriate within the work environment, then we need to be very disciplined ourselves about how we behave, because that really is what determines the culture of the organization or the team around us. And lastly, I would just say that what we're talking about here, and in fact what we're talking about throughout the whole course, is about recognizing that we cannot control lots in our lives. We may be able to control what we eat. What I can't do is control what my children eat. I may want to. I may put stuff in their lunchbox, and as I did this morning, and try to persuade them to take it to school to eat it. But I can't make them eat at school. I can't stop them from swapping their food with a friend. All I can do is influence them. And I definitely can't control what Putin eats. So that's way out of my league. There's no point in getting worked up about what might be happening there if it's outside of my control. So there's a tendency, I think, to think about trying to bring things more into our control. And we perhaps feel that we can influence things more than we cannot. We get hung up on stuff that actually is outside of our boundary. I think rather than concerning ourselves with control, we need to be thinking more about how we increase the influence, our ability to influence situations around us. And there is an important difference there. It's not about control, it's about influence. Influencing, thinking about our own behavior and how that influences others. Obviously, when we're planning stuff, looking at processes, interpersonal skills, etc., all of which is about influence. It's not about control. So in summary, there are different leadership styles, and the three big themes are around transactional, transformational, and systems thinking. Remember how you like to be led and think about how you might be leading others. And the motivation does come from within. And so if we have a temptation to be more transactional than adopt other forms of leadership, then try and check ourselves sometimes to think, does this person really not want to do the work? Or perhaps is there something that is stopping them from doing the work to their best ability? In which case, perhaps we could work on the system around them rather than on the person themselves. So you're going to vary your leadership style depending on the situation. And lastly, you're going to think more about influence rather than control. And obviously there's a raft, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of references out there on leadership more broadly. But there isn't that much out there around leadership within the conservation sector. And I would encourage you to look at work by people like my colleague Simon Black, who has written a number of papers around leadership. There have been a few papers published in conservation biology and other various journals. But as you become, I think, as you grow as a conservation professional, and obviously many of you are in much more senior positions than I'm in, we do need to take on board this understanding of leadership. And leadership is not facilitation. We've made that clear right at the start. As a facilitator, you're not a leader. But that doesn't mean to say you can't adopt some of the lessons from facilitation to improve your leadership style. And I think it's really important for us to think about working on the system around people rather than trying to change people themselves. Okay, that really brings me to the end of the webinar. Does anybody have any questions or observations that they would like to make, either in the chat box or you could turn your microphone on? I'm just looking now to see if anybody's got any comments. Okay, Gary's saying, curious then that people seek one style of leadership. Sorry, I need to just bring up your chat. Curious that people seek one style of leadership but often deliver on another. And I think, and there are lots of reasons for that. I don't know, is this, Gary, would you like to add to that with, do you want to verbally talk a little bit more about that? Go for it, Gary.
Yes, sorry, Phil. I think it's about modelling, isn't it? I think so often we've worked under a leadership regime not been happy with it, but then when we move into that leadership role, we adopt what it is that we know. We emulate what it is that we've seen, and it's an odd thing.
Yes, yeah, I agree. There is organizational cultures or team cultures they are changeable, but they take time to change. You have to be very kind of actively aware of what you need to do to make those sorts of changes. And sometimes, people don't immediately respond to more kind of transformational or system style leadership if they've been used to more of a transactional style. So sometimes you may feel it would be more helpful to do things in a different way, but the initial response is not as you would expect it to be, because people are used to a way of operating. And I mean, I don't know whether this is backed up by any evidence, but I know with colleagues and people that I've worked for, a couple of CEOs in particular who are very influential in my life, they're saying, it can take you 3 or 4 years to really change the culture of a place so that it is open to a different way of doing things. So it's not going to be something that probably changes overnight. I do think, though, that there are certain, I think the behavioural bit is really important, and I think there are certain things that we can do that people will respond to. And I do think, I know I keep banging on about listening, but I do think that if we can become better at things like listening, that it has so many sort of positive ramifications, and it is something that seems to influence culture quite quickly. I've noticed that when you start asking clarifying questions or checking back with somebody if you've understood them, that others around you start doing it. Within a relatively few meetings, people will start changing the way in which they interact with each other. It does seem to be quite powerful, but it's not something that changes overnight, and we are going to be influenced by the leadership styles around us. Thanks very much for that comment. Does anybody else have anything they want to say? I'm aware that this is it's different from what we've been talking about before, but I do think it's particularly important for you're all in significant roles, and it is important for us to spend time reflecting on this. I mean, the first thing is if we know about it, if we know that we have a tendency to lead in a particular way that may not be the most helpful, then that's obviously the first step towards doing things a little bit differently. And we're not going to suddenly become completely different people, because actually that's a false thing to do as well. But we can just influence ourselves to do things in a slightly different way. Does anybody have any other thoughts they wanted to add on, perhaps that leadership, that inventory of kind of how you experience you're being led at the moment versus how you prefer to be led? Okay, Taneke, do you want to ask your question? Because it would be good for people to make your comment. If we do, Taneke, if you perhaps, are you happy to speak just now, and then Bahar could make his point? Okay, your speaker doesn't work. Great, no problem. I'll have a look at your comment. So, how would you suggest a manager changes his styles? Well, my thought would be that if you've got no idea. I think there's one in a talk next week. We're going to talk about something called the Beckhardt model, which looks at purpose, goals, roles, processes, relationships. And I think it is useful for, if you're trying to think about how could I do things better, would be to sit back and say, how clear is our purpose within our team? How clear is our goals? How clear are people's roles? And ask yourself a few simple questions about how things are functioning now. And inevitably, you're going to turn up some areas that you could work on, which would be, and I actually think the systems thinking approach is perhaps, in a way, it's the easiest one for people to adopt, because you don't have to be suddenly this out front leader with this huge charisma and booming voice. You can do things very quietly, but you can work on things that are aware, that are getting in the way of people doing work. And one thing that I think gets in the way quite a lot is the complexity of processes. So that over time, things like, how do you apply for submit budgetary plans and get money out? Sometimes those processes become really cumbersome. There are lots of steps you need to go through. Or there may be other protocols that are developed that were all done with good intentions, but they grow a bit like trees, and you have to prune them back. So sometimes I think working on processes that you think that people are not doing that bit of the job very well, or they could do it better. Is there something we could do to make what they're doing simpler or easier for them to accomplish? So I think there are some easy things you can do if you move more in the systems thinking than suddenly trying to become a transformational style of leader. And just a second point I'd make is ask your staff, and if you've got, perhaps you can't do it with everybody, but somebody who you trust, I would ask them about how you come across, and they will give you some ideas as to what you could do differently. Whether it's using this XY questionnaire that might be a bit formal, but you could ask your staff to fill that in and give it in, and you use that as you wish, as a reflection point, or just ask somebody. And I think that will, it's all about. We're not going to suddenly change overnight, but if we can, make small changes that keep making us a little bit better, I think people will respond well to it. I don't know whether I'm really answering your question, Nick, but I think there are some simple things we can do. Vicky, we'll come to you in a second. Bahar, you had a question.
Yes, I was going to ask how to differentiate between the role as a leader, individual leader, and the leader of a organization. I mean, when you're leading a group, you are not going to bring the desired results or the outcomes, and how to proceed forward. I mean, how to differentiate the role of individual leader and the leader of a organization.
When you say individual leader, so are you talking about sort of a leader further down the organization? So you might be in charge of a team of people, but you're not in charge of the overall organization?
Yeah, true.
Yeah. There is some very good research that suggests that at the top of organizations, leaders seem to understand their role and more or less kind of perform it reasonably well. And where things often seem to fall apart is at the middle management level, where you've got team leaders or department heads or things like that. And it's like it seems to be that they've kind of adopted some of their managerial responsibilities. So they know where we've got to go to, so that they enforce certain rules and they make sure certain things happen, but they neglect their leadership responsibilities. And depending on the organization, there's no reason why a leader at a team level can't be doing all the same things as a leader at the top level. It is possible to develop a departmental vision or a team vision about what we're trying to do. Clearly, it needs to fit into the organization's one, but there's no reason why you can't go through all the same steps that somebody who runs a whole organization does, but further down. That's leaving aside the fact that within your organization, there may be cultural, difficulties in doing that. There are challenges, but I don't see that there actually being a big distinction between a leader halfway down the organization, or in fact, right at the bottom of the organization, as opposed to at the top. I don't know whether that really answers your question, but I don't know. I mean, does that? Would you disagree with that, or?
No, but that helps. That helps to differentiate. I mean, it's quite challenging or quite interesting rather to intermingle the roles as a leader when you're trying to lead a team, small team, yeah. And at the same time you're trying to lead a organization or a team of the organization.
Yeah.
So there are some role differentiation I have to play, but yeah, that's interesting and challenging equally.
And
Thank
I know
you.
what you mean. And you know what we've talked about within the rest of the course, where the majority has been concerned with what do you do within a planning workshop. What you're actually, you're not playing a leadership role as a facilitator, but you are helping the group to go through some of the similar steps that you'd want that team to go through if they were just functioning within an organization. You know, you want them to decide what are we here to achieve? You know, how are we going to know when we get there? What's the system we're working in? You know, all of these sorts of questions that if you were actually leading that team, you'd ask them to go through. You'd talk about your own culture. And you do find teams within organizations that function very differently to the rest of the organization. And so that's where somebody is deciding, or the group is deciding, we are going to define ourselves within this space. And yeah, there are going to be boundaries around you. There are going to be things that you can't control, but there is going to be a degree of influence there to create an environment, a team environment, in which you feel that you are all able to do the best work. That might fall to a particular leader, or it might just be through the group, you know, working together and using some of their facilitation skills. So there doesn't need to be a defined leader. They just they just work on it to work it out together. So you can do that. It's not easy, but we're all in a similar situation. I think that, you know, few of us work in the perfect organization where, you know, the sky's the limit and you're free to do whatever you want. But I think there are things that we can influence. And this business about clarity of purpose, clarity of goals, thinking about roles. Does everybody know within the team what their role is and how it relates to other people in the team? Which is something to say we'll talk more about next week. I think that's quite powerful and helpful within teams.
Right. That helps to remind the team members repeatedly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to go to, I'm aware of what is the time now. Okay, so we're coming up, we've got a couple of minutes left. I can see 2 points. So Vicky, do you want to say something, or do you want me to go with the, shall I go with the, do you want to talk about your comment? Do you want to turn your microphone on, or is yours not working? Let me just have a look at, I'll just have a look at what you've got down. So Vicky is saying that she did a motivational exercise before where you list what motivates you and then state where you are now on these, and then discuss how things can change to move you towards a better situation for your motivation. Then review these as part of your annual review. Yeah, that, and this is, they're not difficult things to do, are they? Is to kind of just reflect on what's happening at the moment. You're doing a bit of a kind of a situational assessment, like you would do with a you know, plan for a species. You know, what's going on? What do we know? What do we think we know? Why is it? Why do I? You know, where I am at the moment, and where do I want to get to? And I think there is, if you haven't already got it, and I'm sure most of you will have it on your shelves, but there's, I think, a very useful, simple leadership book by Stephen Covey, which I'll talk more about next week, which is 7 Habits of Effective People, or Highly Effective People. And I think there's some really good pointers in there that are about you becoming a more effective individual, us becoming more effective individuals, and in so doing, you're going to become more effective as a leader as well. But it's very much about self-improvement, around self-control, the stuff that you can actually influence, and how that then can positively change things around you. And actually, you made the point about annual review, Vicky, as well. There's, I don't know, you know, if you're having annual reviews with your manager and anything comes out that's a surprise, then you're not being managed the best way you could be. There should be no surprises in those annual reviews. And it would be wonderful if actually within the review you had a chance to kind of reflect on and talk about, you know, how motivated you felt and what's got in the way of that and what one could do differently. And a lot of the things that would improve the situation are not difficult to change. But like with a lot of what we talk about in this course, it's about getting things out in the open. Once it's in the arena, once people know about it, then you can start thinking about what you do. Sally's asking about any tips on how to encourage a manager to change their style to suit you better. But it partly depends on how open they are to receiving feedback. And I don't know if you haven't already asked, then I think it's worth asking. I think if you have a manager that is managing you too closely, one thing you can do is something called management by exception. And you can influence things a bit, where you go to them and say, okay, with this task or this work I've got to do, I would like to be able to be kind of free to do my best work. So what I want to know is at what point do I need to come and see you because you want to be able to have input into it? And therefore, what stuff can I get on with on my own? And try and have the conversation about the boundary between your responsibility and where your ability to manage things and where they need to come in. And what you're trying to do is kind of define that line and perhaps push it up a little bit, saying, well, if I'm able to get this done within the next 2 weeks, can I just come and see you once it's all done? And if I don't see you, it's because it will be done on time. If it looks like it's going to go over, I will come and see you. So maybe there are things you can do to have that conversation about where the line sits between you and them, if you've got somebody who manages you too closely. The other thing, I think, within a team, if you're in a particular team, that actually you can maybe talk more generally about some of the stuff we've talked about within this course. Is it worth us looking a bit more at what are our individual roles and how we're going to operate within meetings? I've just done this course. Would it be possible for me to take control of this side and see if you can influence the culture within the team without having to focus on the individual themselves? Ideally, they're open to having some sort of feedback, but they may well not be. If not, then maybe management by exception. And then there are other general things one can do to influence how the team might operate. I don't really know, Sally, whether that's particularly helpful. And if anybody else has got any other points, then please do add. Okay, I'm aware we've slipped over into over the hour, so we should really draw this to a close. But I've really enjoyed. I've basically been talking at you for an hour, but it's been very nice having the questions and comments back. This is a big area. It goes well beyond the facilitation side that we're talking about within the course. But I think it's important for us to understand that what we're trying to develop on paper within a planning workshop is going to result hopefully in some implementation. And when implementation occurs, some of these factors are going to start playing a role. But understanding some of it is helpful in thinking about the actual work that's going to get done as a consequence of the plan. Thank you very much indeed. If you've not already got back to me about your availability for next week, then please do so we can give you a meeting request. And if you've got any questions about the course, obviously next week is the last week. We will leave the course open for 2 weeks after. If you want the certificate of completion of the course, then you do need to have completed all of the knowledge checks and gone through all the material. We'll give you those extra 2 weeks to do that, including the personal action plan. And if you want to go for the certificate of reflective practice, please get in touch. And if you just want to keep the contact up, which I'm going to be trying to do with you anyway, then please do so, because the aim is not to get people on the course, it's to help people to be doing more planning. So we'd see this very much as the start of the relationship rather than coming to the end. All the best. Have a good weekend, and we'll speak to you again. Bye for now.